좀 꺼주세요. My paper is about 9 or 10 pages, but I'm not going to read everything in there. And I will just show a few examples. But some of the images that I was going to show have been already shown by other people, so my talk will be even shorter. How are we doing with time?
We're just fine.
Fine, okay. So I think my title, The Shaping of Korean Art Curators Abroad Through Public Diplomacy, is a bit different from what you think public diplomacy is. Actually, if you go into the Korea Foundation's website, you will find our program that is a support for art abroad, art museums abroad, under culture, not public diplomacy. But I will start my talk by showing a very good example of public diplomacy and how it affected the creation of a Korean art gallery at a museum. The title page that I'm showing is the current exhibition of Korean Art Gallery at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. In the sphere of culture, the 21st century can be labeled the era of public diplomacy. The Korea Foundation engages in and support public diplomacy through a variety of activities, but many people may be unaware of the organization's important work in the field of art. The website of the USC's Center on Public Diplomacy contains a definition of cultural diplomacy that appropriately describe the Korea Foundation's effort to promote the globalization of Korean culture and art, especially its support for overseas museums and support for Korean studies program. It says, public diplomacy includes such activities as educational exchange programs for scholars and student visitors programs, language training, cultural events, and exchanges. I will not read the whole thing, but I will simply flip through and you can just read through quickly. I might be applying the term public diplomacy in a slightly different way from the KF's official position. However, I would like to focus attention on the invitation of distinguished individuals. Again, I am quoting the KF homepage on the invitation of distinguished individuals. It invites distinguished individuals from social, cultural, and academic circles to Korea. These visits aim to broaden the individual's understanding of Korea and its people. During their stay in Korea, the guests have the opportunity to visit relevant Korean organizations and participate in academic and cultural events, through which they can share their opinions and knowledge with their Korean counterparts and gain first-hand experience in Korea's rich history and culture. That's the quotation from the Korea Foundation's website. I will also highlight the important influence of Korean curators in overseas museums and the Korea Foundation's active support of programs, since they form an important part of public diplomacy activity. I would like to cite one example of how the KF's intellectual exchange program resulted in the creation of Korean Art Gallery at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. The late Dr. Peter Marzio, who had held the museum's directorship for 28 years, was invited to Korea in the spring of 2004. After this trip, he became determined to create a Korean art gallery at MFAH. I have known Peter since 1990, when I was first sent there as a lecturer sponsored by the International Cultural Society of Korea. And this was before the establishment of the Korea Foundation in December of 1991. So at this time, Peter is standing in the middle, and on my right, there is a gentleman with glasses. He is a Professor Kim Gi-hyuk, history professor. So he and I traveled more than 10 US cities to give lectures on Korean history and Korean art. So this is before the Korea Foundation. So to speak, it's a mother organization. And Peter sent me a letter, very short, but I was talking to Dr. Lehman of Brooklyn Museum during lunchtime, and what he said was what I'm going to say right now. He said that Peter was someone who really does what he said to do. So he said he will do. So the letter, it's very short. Peter's letter is always very short. It says, "You won the hearts and minds of Houston. Thanks for giving us such a wonderful insight into Korean art. Please come back again. It would be an honor for us to work with you in the future. I hope the rest of your trip was good." Very short letter, but it was so moving, so I kept the letter until today. And then, sure enough, he invited me again in 2003, May of 2003. And so I gave another lecture at the museum. This time I talked about how the court painters also worked to decorate the surface of the Korean pots. And then we worked together very closely from this time on. And so he was invited as distinguished guest of Korea Foundation the next year. And when I saw him in Washington, D.C., he was thrilled that he really liked Korea, and he was determined to open a Korean art gallery at his museum. This is the picture of Peter receiving a check from the Korea Foundation through Consul General of Houston, Kim Jong-un. Some of these valuable photos were given to me by Christine Stockman of Houston, who is sitting right there. So now this is the view of Korean Art Gallery, which opened with the loan of National Museum and some others, including my heirloom vase somewhere in there. Now, I want to skip the annual workshop because it was covered by Keith so very well. So I will skip a great deal. And also, at the end of my paper, I gave you two appendices. The first one is where and when the Korea Foundation's Korean Art Gallery was opened, either newly opened or expanded, and so on. But you can have a look, but you don't even have to look at it because Keith gave us such a good report. So now I can go directly to the cases of the 5 U.S. museums with the Korean art curator. The first one, the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. This one also I don't need to reiterate because Dr. Xu gave us a complete picture. But it was really the first time that Korea Foundation gave fund to install a Korean art curatorship in that museum. So this was the first museum. And she was so well qualified Korean art specialist. She has a PhD in East Asian art under Michael Sullivan, but she had her BA in Korea, so she was both fluent in Korean and English. These are the views of Goryeo Dynasty exhibition, which Mr. Xu talked about in great deal. So I will go very fast. And then now the Asian Art Museum just opened the new show in grand style, celebrations in Korean art during the Joseon Dynasty. And in my lecture in October when I visited the museum, I concentrated on these aspects of Korean art along with the royal documents. And then the second museum is, of course, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Since So-young is not here, and no one talked much about Metropolitan, I should talk a little bit about Korean Art Gallery. The Met's Arts of Korea Gallery was opened with the joint support of the KF and the Samsung Foundation of Culture in June 1998. The project was carried out under the direction of Professor Won-C Fong of Princeton University, my advisor at Princeton, who was then serving as the consultative chair of the Asian Art Department at the museum. I must say that all through my graduate student days, I had such tense time with him that I was always very unhappy. But then after my graduation, I was able to work with him to create the Korean Art Gallery. And since then, we became really very good friends to this date. The opening exhibition, Arts of Korea, was accompanied by the impressive book of the same title with 511 pages, co-authored by several leading scholars of Korean art, Chung Yang-mo, An Hui-jun, Lee Sung-mi, Kim Lee-na, Kim Hong-nam, Park Young-suk, Jonathan Best, who had worked together and co-curated the opening exhibition. The banner, the design of the banner came from a design of Koryo Saladon, and the two views of the gallery, along with the Bodhisattva, which is in Met collection at that time. Metropolitan has very good Buddhist paintings in their collection. And so the opening exhibition, Arts of Korea, was accompanied by the book. So I will show you the cover of the book. And actually, for a long time, and even now, this has been used as almost like a reference book on Korean art in the English-speaking world. And so Professor An Hui-jun, myself, with Professor Won Fong at the opening of the Korean Art Gallery. And the Metropolitan Museum finally appointed So Young Lee, a Columbia PhD and a specialist in Korean ceramics. And she did several exhibitions, and some of them are listed here: Art of the Korean Renaissance, Poetry in Clay, Korean Puncheong, ceramics from the Lium. And she received help from curator and a ceramic specialist, Chun Seung-chang. These two exhibitions were also accompanied with very good catalog. And now the Metropolitan is hosting this wonderful exhibition, Silla, Korea's Golden Kingdom. I already saw the catalog on the table outside. So if you are interested, you can look through the catalog. So I have a great deal of attachment to Metropolitan's Korean Art Gallery, as much as I do with Houston. And then the Philadelphia Museum was talked about by Mr. Robs so much, so I can really skip. But I would like to point out that this is the third museum in the U.S. that appointed full-time curator of Korean art. And Hyun-Soo Woo even has endowed the chair position of the Maxine and Howard Lewis Associate Curator of Korean Art. This is wonderful. So now Philadelphia Museum, even before that, was quite good in organizing an exhibition of Korean art. This was the year 2003, and I was able to visit the museum at the opening because I was in Washington, D.C. with my husband, who was serving as ambassador to Washington. So instead of the ambassador going there and delivering the opening remark, I said congratulations to the museum. And then Puncheong ceramicist Yoon Kwang-jo is regarded highly both at home and abroad. So these are the works of Yoon Kwang-jo and two images of him. And Puncheong, as you know, stopped. Puncheong existed only in very short period of time in Korean history, between the end of Goryeo and before the Hideyoshi invasion at the end of the 16th century. But now Puncheong happens to be the type of ceramics from which modern Korean ceramicists can develop their own imagination and interest and whatnot. So Puncheong by Yoon Kwang-jo, I think, is owned by most of the museums with Asian art collection abroad. And the Philadelphia, this image was shown by Mr. Rob, even in better slides, but I want to show you this image in the corner of several people who form the Korean Heritage Group. Because of this group, the Philadelphia Museum's Korean Art Gallery is really going very well in fundraising and securing new objects and so on. So I'm standing with Dr. Phyllis Fisher in the center. I think this is Dr. Phyllis Fisher. Can you see the pointer? No? Where? Oh, here. Okay, that's Phyllis Fisher and myself and other people in the Korean Heritage Group, which supports the museum. And I have the chart for training process for Korean art curators abroad. Now, I put all the departments of different names, but they're all art history or archaeology or related. So there are 12 places. The chart in your printed version has, I think, 11, but my former institution, the Academy of Korean Studies, was left out because it was not a university, but I decided to put it in. Because the Academy of Korean Studies is an institution with research and graduate school. So we only have graduate student, MA and PhD, and most of the time we devote into research. So this is really the ideal situation. This was the ideal situation for me. And then other graduate schools with similar related fields. And so it looks like Korea is producing enough art history students to go around everywhere, but it's not true. And then we have this language training. I think Dr. Xu cited two very unusual examples of interns who could function very well in Korean and English. But most people who are trained in Korea alone will not be able to do the same. So the requirement that KF puts, candidates should be fluent in native language of the country concerned, is, I think, a bit too much asking. I would say that even though one is not so fluent in English or other country, the language of the country concerned, he or she should be sent and trained. And I think currently it's maximum 6 months, but I should think that it should be lengthened to a year. Now the language training in Korea should be enough if you count all the years students spend. Now I think recently even grade school students learn English from native speakers. So I think from, let's say, 10, 20 years from now, Korean students will be much better in the English-speaking environment, functioning better. But right now, I think it's not enough because they lack the actual exercise situation. So now, I would like to suggest Korea Foundation to initiate the exchange student program, like the internship, 1-year period student exchange program for language and cultural training. Because if you just went to school in Korea and suddenly put in the Western art, in a museum in Western country, the culture is very different. So it takes time to get adjusted to new culture. And then this is very important. Professor Haufler will point out that I only talked about Korean side of training program. But in the US, there are schools, there are universities where one can get training. So now there are only 2 places where a Korean art historian is installed as a full-time professor. Since 1991, the KF supported the establishment of 113 Korean studies professorship throughout the world. Of these, only 2 are art history positions. Dr. Berglind Jungmann at UCLA and most recently University of Kansas appointed Dr. Maya Stiller to Korean art professorship. Now, I would like to show several more images of myself doing something that's somewhat unusual. These 2 images are from the same trip as the one I showed you first with Dr. Peter Mazzio. The one on the right is Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. And I remember this was August 15th, 1990. And as many of you know, August 15th is really our national day. So I was really moved by the fact that I am talking about Korean art and culture on our national day for the first time in the Western country, Western Art Museum. And the other picture is at Kansas City, Nelson Gallery at Kansas City, Mark Wilson, and the red-shawled lady is my friend from Berkeley. What's her name? Elizabeth Fulder, right? With all these names, but we were TAs together, and we spent much time together. And then I'm not a Buddhist art specialist or architecture specialist, but I was invited to give a lecture on Korean Buddhist temples at the Asia Society in Washington, D.C., April 19, 1993. At this time, my lecture has been arranged the year before. And of course, at that time, I didn't know that my husband would be Foreign Minister of Korea at this time. So, but anyway, I went and I gave a lecture on Korean Buddhist temple. Before going to Washington, D.C., I went to several Buddhist temples to refresh my memory of the architecture and surrounding. And I think Dr. Chung Hyung Min if she's here, will remember that she and I went to Haeinsa together. And then, of course, University of Kansas invited me to be the Murphy Lecturer, the 21st annual Murphy Lecture Series in Art. So that was a 2 weeks period. And then in 2006, Kansas also invited me again to do another lecture. It's a single lecture invitation. And then while my husband was serving as ambassador to US, I went around to US museums and universities and other communities to do lectures whenever my husband traveled to different cities. So in slightly less than 2 years period, I did 20 such cultural lectures. And this is, of all places, West Point. Rainy day in West Point. And then this is University of Michigan. University of Michigan's Korean Art Gallery opened in 2009 with the collection of Korean art they purchased from the Hackenkamp collection. And so I helped create the Korean Art Gallery in some ways. And then my last slide shows, second to the last, Museum of Canadian Civilization. And notice what I'm wearing. For the first time in anywhere, I wore Korean costume, hanbok, to deliver a lecture on Korean women. Before that, I published a book in English titled Fragrance, Elegance, and Beauty, Korean Women in Arts and Humanities. So they invited me to do a lecture on Korean art and Korean women, but it was Canadian Women's Day, so they asked me to wear Korean costume. And so my conclusion is very simple. Public diplomacy activities such as intellectual exchanges, training programs, and special exhibitions of Korean art in museums abroad have been successful in slowly building recognition for Korean art. The support of the Korea Foundation has been a key part of this development, as well as the overseas museums' efforts to hire Korean art curators. So they go hands in hands. In the future, efforts to build on these programs and to cultivate more Korean curators should be further promoted through public diplomacy. Thank you.